So, for this episode of Coffeeecontalk, we have the pleasure of inviting Mr. Smit Gade. Smit sir is a visiting professor at Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics, Pune. He's also a senior data and research manager at Good Business Labs. Welcome to Coffeeecontalk, sir.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, so now we start with the interview. So the first question would be asked by me, which is, so impact evaluation is one of the many interesting areas of research in development of economics. And we wonder what is it that makes it so interesting. So could you please share some of your experiences while working in this field?
Yeah, so I think impact evaluation in general have emerged as a big research area in last kind of a couple of decades, I would say. I think Esther Duflo, Abhijit Banerjee, Michael Kramer, who got Nobel a couple of years back, have major role to play to popularize this. And I think there are multiple I mean, you might have heard there's a lot of people opposing RCTs as a form which has kind of taken predominant role in development economy, right? So impact evaluations are not always synonymous to RCTs, but they're kind of closely related. So I'll just go on talking bit about what impact evaluations are, give some example and why they have become so popular. So one of the things that kind of people when try to solve development problems earlier, they had two major issues: lack of data as well as computational power, right? Once we started moving into the 21st century, both of them started becoming available. And what people realize is some of the methods of that we've been using as economists, essentially at national or subnational levels using data sets, there are many questions that we can't answer using those, right? Because these data sets are designed for broad purposes, but if you want to measure a particular thing, many times you won't be able to answer those questions, right? And also, if you are trying to, so you need either natural experiments, some variations to have this, and they are not always available for the topic which you're interested in. So what people got interested is in, like, can we actually uh, design experiments to actually know things which we are interested in very precise manner. So what people then started doing was try to kind of work at small scale, either beginning small scale or small programs, and try to actually run randomized control trial where, in very crude sense, what you would do is, if you're interested to see how program works, you will randomly assign to half people, don't give it to half people, and then track these people across time, right? So as so what you're trying to address here is majorly selection bias. What I mean by that is, for example, say you want to compare education intervention, right? So if you say what, like, the question you're trying to address is, what is the impact of kind of students going to English medium schools going to, say, Marathi medium school, right? Like, you want to test that. Now if you just go and check, like, also what you can do is go to a few English medium school, check and run some tests and check the ability of students in, say, 9th or 10th standard in English medium and Marathi medium, and you find that English medium schools are doing better than Marathi medium schools, right? That's what we want. Does that mean English medium schools are better, right? So then somebody might come and ask you, hey, that might not be the case. The students which come to, say, Marathi medium school might be from different socioeconomic background. Their parents might not invest. They might not have this issue. So then you can't actually claim these things, right? So then you would have to kind of design a policy. For example, one of the way would be, then you would say, hey, if you give students voucher total in this school, and then put some students who would go to Marathi medium school to English medium school, and then compare, then you will see how it's happening, right? or you would kind of do other way around if it's possible, right? So you will try to other way to kind of minimize or on an average the differences that exist, right? So that's when it allowed people to kind of analyze much more problem in smaller details, and that's why it has been kind of something that people have held, where you can actually address selection bias more effectively, and then you can actually say measure particular thing. Say if you want to say mental health is your outcome, but you can actually go and survey people on loneliness if that's your outcome indicator, right? So it gives us every researchers a lot of freedom. So that's why from research product but also the second point it kind of boils down to, which I think is very important, is you are not on your desk analyzing data. Like for to do this you have to actually go work with people to implement this, right? So then you have to actually not only you understand a lot about the exact research question, but you understand the context better, you understand very small things while you're doing field work implementing an intervention, right? So that gives us not only just the research outcomes but also much deeper understanding of ground, because you need to be kind of work with people to get this done. You understand limitations, you understand on ground conditions, how people are reacting. So you get a lot of that knowledge from actually working on the ground with people, right? And that's, I think, is very valuable, and that's why it's become very popular.
Yeah, right. Along the same lines, a bit about development economics. So we see that development economics has increasingly become an extremely popular field of study.
Hmm.
So could you throw some light on the various avenues that are open for a student studying development economics?
So I mean, there are kind of so it's funny because like there are many definitions of what development economics is, and one of the tautological definition I think is anything that we study in developing countries is development economics, right? So essentially anything you will do in India would by default become development economics. So if you have a career in economics, you like then you probably have a career in development economics, because that's how it's defined. But kind of you're right that this has become more prominent. There are multiple factors behind it, and I think two to three major things I think. So one is essentially field research, like if you're interested in research specifically, right? So the avenue, because a research field research requires much larger teams. So, for example, earlier, if you say you were working on NSSO data, you would need a researcher associate who is based out of your university, who is working on their computer, right? And that's the only probably team that you'd require. But so that limits the number of people you. But if you go to say field experiments now, like huge teams, right? We have a project which is going on, which has around 4 to 5 research associates, multiple field associates just working on one particular project. And along with that, we have surveyors, which sometimes go in 3 digits, right? Which will hope to go in 3 digits, right? So this is a huge scale. Like it's essentially running a big project. So that means that requirement is larger, and as so that's one way in research that has increased, right? For and then for if you are have masters, then you have good avenues to work in research there. Second avenue I think has come just purely because government laws. So government CSR laws changing has essentially, then now companies have to put in like 2% of their profit in kind of social projects, right? And that kind of financial flow has kind of made a lot of NGOs work in this space. Like a lot of people have a lot of money to work, and that has resulted in kind of a NGOs which are working, b the consultancies that support NGOs, and then they do their evaluation, right? So then, for example, lot of M&E, like monitoring and evaluation work that comes in, where like if a program is happening, how do you see that program is doing? And also some of the things that have kind of happened over the past few years is that people have realized that not all programs work well. And so to kind of improve how the programs are measured has become kind of important factor for a lot of people who are funding these programs. And so that requires a lot of people who have some level of technical know-how and expertise, right? And that has become a good avenue for kind of econ graduates to work on. So these are two things. And then the third one is obviously, as kind of country grows, it has more disposable income to kind of devote to these issues. And so that has, by as India has grown, the sector just has grown proportionally, right? Because we have a lot of problems that need to be solved, new schemes that come in that needs to be evaluated, designed, worked on. So all of these, and also, I mean, we it's difficult to say good or bad, but essentially the government has kind of, as a policy, post liberalization has moved to kind of reduce the number of permanent government employees and try to get more through consultants or like on contract basis, right? So that essentially has led to lot of, for example, if government has a development project, it essentially, instead of hiring, say for example, a project which we are working in Jharkhand, it's with government of Jharkhand's women and child development, but but women and child development won't actually have all the people on that project as their payroll, right? So then they would essentially contract out to NGOs or consultancies to do a lot of work. And that kind of approach has kind of also resulted in a lot of work getting created for people. And I think these are all kind of avenues depending on your interest, how core research you want to go, right? Compared to how implementation heavy projects you want to go. So these are all kind of spectrum of avenue that are open to students. And that's just from professional point of view, right? Like, I mean, you can always go into academia.
Right. Now, we would like to know more about the socialist and neoliberal schools of thought when it comes to poverty.
Yeah, that's a very kind of shifting gears question. So yeah, so I think it's a way, like, again, like the debate that, or the things that I have to say actually links well with earlier question of kind of trying to think about things in abstract and trying to relate and come up with suggestions based on that, compared to actually talking about things in concrete or in kind of real world scenarios, right? Like, so for example, the most, I think, I'll come to the question, but I think for most important question a lot of times are in their details, right? So for example, instead of thinking about whether this is a socialist policy or this is a neoliberal thing, and ideology or like fundamental principles driving it, many times it's important to look at things on the ground, right? Like, and see what works. For example, so just to kind of recap, socialism in its like pure theoretical form would mean that the means of production are not owned by individuals but owned by society as a whole, and then they get redistributed across people. So you try to achieve equality, right? So nobody own the ownership of the means of production remains with either like like government, let's say, right? That's socialist. While capitalism is essentially private property, right? And then they have way more rights to kind of decide which transaction they want to partake, and whichever means of production they owe, they kind of have rights to use it as they please, right? There is a two spectrum. So I don't think there are almost, I mean, there are some countries still which are on socialist realm, but there are almost no country which are on the capitalist end, right? So most of the countries lie somewhere in the middle, right? Like, so US, for example, is a huge socialist country if you look at the welfare scheme they have for people, right? Or say Scandinavia, Western European countries, right? So the countries have tried to kind of get find a middle path. So essentially, capitalism, one of the major, there are two major things that capitalism gives, right? One is it gives people incentives to innovate, work, right? Secondly, it also kind of markets which capitalism, it tells you price is a signal for importance of goods, right? Whether the price rise or price lowering produce signal to producers about whether this good should be produced more or less, right? And that kind of churn is good, or like that gives people signal. While in socialism, what you're trying to achieve is equality, right? Fairness. So in capitalism, what countries have tried to do is to kind of achieve all three. Like most of the country will try to achieve all three, right? And maximum welfare for their people. Now, how to do that is the tricky question, right? Like, and a lot of times the answer to same problems might be different according to country's context where it stands, right? So for example, so in that case, for poverty alleviation, for example, if you go to say US, you might actually say, okay, in case of the US, which is a rich economy, might be you might prefer to have more redistribution going to people, right? For example, not exactly, but just an example. While country like India, even though there is a lot of poverty, we are just too poor to redistribute, right? And that could be a valid thing. Now, so that's the case, but the other way argument would be India is so poor that we cannot afford not to kind of redistribute, right? Because the condition in which poor in India live is so precarious that it's imperative to kind of support them and help them, right? So these are all kind of moral ideological argument, right? The question where it kind of rests and comes to poverty then becomes like end goal is how do you help as much poor as possible, right? Like as many poor as possible to greatest extent, right? Like numerically number of poor you can help, also how much you can help the each person, right? That becomes your objective. Now it, like at very crude level, it depends on two things, right? Like how big income you have to redistribute and how you're redistributing it, right? If your country becomes richer, you just have larger pie which you can redistribute, or if you have same pie but you redistribute it more fairly or equally, then you will have a much better outcome for poor. So what I mean, there is enough literature now that shows that India's growth has helped poor in India, right? Like the number of poor in India has reduced. Now the argument then becomes, could we have helped them even more, right? But the issue there is like, for example, some of the clear indication of like we had too much socialism rather than too little is, for example, it's clear that in 1991 where we reduce some of, I mean, it's essentially external trade plus socialism, but removed some of the restrictions that kind of spurred economic growth, and that essentially helped everyone throughout the spectrum. It helped people at the top much more than people at the bottom, but it still kind of helped everyone, right? So it's important to understand where your country lies and what are the like mechanism they have. So instead of kind of trying to analyze a blanket thing, you'd probably want to then see at individual basis. For example, you'd want to understand, say, social protection schemes, right? So, for example, do you need schemes like NREGA, which gives people work and access social protection? And it completely makes sense depending on precarity of people, right? And that's great initiative that government, and that's more in socialist, right? But do you want, for example, more import limitation, like for example, and then that thinking many times lead to, if you try to just restrict import, that affects your ability to export as well, right? So then is it a good policy to kind of try to promote homegrown industries by restricting import, right? And that becomes a question for you, right? Like for example, how do you solve it? And I think instead of like a lot of times, instead of trying to think in terms of whether socialism helps poverty or capitalism help poverty, instead of kind of thinking in these big huge abstract terms, try to kind of narrow it down and try to see whether, because most of the countries are trying to find this gap, right, where they want to do. Indian government has kind of always been left of center, where all governments have tried to implement like pro poor policy in some sense, right? So then trying to understand each policy, each decision on its own merit, understanding it, what context it's helping people with, and what are its short term and long term consequences. Those are the things that I'll use these lenses, and trying to keep both these lenses on, where you should also realize that, for example, like government's rule in many cases is setting rules of the games, right? And if they're not set well, so for example, like you can have kind of monopolies, right, which will try to deter competition. And in such some of these cases, that is not kind of what capitalism will ask you to do, right? For example, you would want free competition to kind of essentially drive down prices to well help consumers. So in that case, you need to understand like these principles, like what are the advantages of kind of letting market take over versus what are the advantage of like trying to need to redistribute, and try to find in this any particular context that you're looking at what helps, right? Just like taking a practical approach of how it would impact uh, people in, and also just others thing unintended consequences that you'll have because of that particular decision. Having that lens, looking at practical either data or just talking to people who are affected, is much better way to look at these things. And that's why RCTs or field-based research is helpful, because instead of you taking a theory-based or ideology-based stand a priori, you're trying to get some of the answers. Of course, you need theory, because you can't just go and run experiments randomly, right? That's like waste of resources. You need to put framework, what are the questions you're trying to answer, but then let the answers come from the data on people, and that helps to kind of del policy. Though I'll give one caveat though, like it's not always possible to have all the data, right? And some at some point you will have to take a leap of faith, right? Like some ways where you don't have data, but you still many times need to take decisions, right? Like you have limited data or not all the data you need. In such situation, it kind of helps you to kind of have some of these principles in mind, and then take your best decision based on your prior understanding. So I think most important is, like I would say, both of them are important for poverty elevation, and they help in different ways. And most of the countries try to kind of have both the policies of redistribution as well as allowing markets to function. In which particular case you let markets take the lead or kind of redistribution take the lead, it depends on context to context, country to country situation of people, right? And that's, I think, is important to keep in mind, of having an kind of open mind rather than being just blind to, okay, I love socialism, so I'll always try to go for trying to redistribute and not care for kind of um, productivity. Because historically, kind of we have seen that these experiments of with the countries kind of going towards like socialism haven't gone well, where a lot of time incentives get killed off. And also, ideologically point of view, you are essentially taking away individual rights of people, right? Like, so you are essentially taking rights of people away and then telling them what to do. So they don't have agency over the decisions in their lives. And that you need great power, concentrated great power, to impose that on people, right? You need something strong enough so that you force people to do what you tell them to do. And just the unintended consequence then becomes that power itself becomes big hurdle in development, because that has to be held by some people, right? Like some organization, people, institution. And that expecting that to remain noble forever is almost a very utopian thinking. And that's where a lot of governance problems start coming in. Like, and this is not just true for kind of socialist thing, any welfare state that we currently have, that these problems become imminent, right? Like for example, with COVID, like government, like everywhere across, government have increased how much kind of how much life of people they can go in. For example, government can now tell you to install an app in your phone, right? Like, and people will accept it. Like government can just, somebody just come and close your building because they think it's right thing to do, right? So I mean, we understand this in context of COVID and essentially public health requirement, but some of these things start increasing state's power, right? So all of these are important decisions where you need to take the context things and matter.
Yeah. So the next question is about gender equity.
Hmm.
So lately, a lot of focus is being like there's been a lot of emphasis on the role of gender equity and equality in the economic development of any particular place, country, region.
Hmm.
So we've seen how during the pandemic, women's labor force participation has been adversely affected across the world.
Hmm.
So, in a country like India, where already there are skewed gender norms for the
Hmm.
longest time, so what do you think this would translate into in terms of India's economic development?
So there are, I think so. I remember when the lockdown started, the narrative was now men are also helping women in the house. So everybody's stuck at home. We don't have help in the household, so everybody is contributing to work. And there were like initially lot of posts because then everybody assumed this is like a 2 month or 1 month phenomenon. um, like everybody now seems so naive there at that time, but but the thing is that time when people started, it kind of started affect, like people thought like men participating in household work would then kind of improve the gender norm in some sense, right? Like, and but like as the time has passed, it's clearly emerged that um, it has harmed women greatly and disproportionately, uh, specifically in economic terms. So what usually happened was that India has one of the lowest labor force participation rate in the world, right? So we are already starting at low, essentially, and the worst part is it's been going down across last 20 years, right? Only the countries which have uh, lower rate of female labor force participation is Middle East country than India, right? So we start already at low baseline, and what happened was a lot of people lost their job due to the pandemic, lockdown, right? But what happened, and a lot of people actually moved out of cities because of the lockdown, right? What happened then was when people went down, and I'm mostly talking about kind of blue collar job. Uh, when it time came, like so it's around people started going back in kind of March, April 2020, and then kind of things started to settle down in June, July, right? Like when the government lockdown norms were like essentially lifted across most places, people started coming back. And what happened was women, not all women who kind of left the jobs came back to the workforce, right? So the when things dropped, they dropped for men and women, but then more for women than men. But also the revival was way higher for men than women. So many women essentially then opted to not join the labor force, and that has been a huge issue, right? And then also what other evidence say in a lot of white collar job, at least in Western country where there exists deeper evidence, is childcare support and schools lockdown meant that somebody from the household was needed to take care of the children, right? And then we know from a lot of evidence that kind of household work or care work predominantly falls on women, and that essentially lack of kind of school or help essentially stop women entering labor forces. And I'm talking about extensive margin first, which is essentially people deciding to kind of join the labor force or not join them. There's also large impact on intensive margin, and what I mean is like amount of work people do. So because even if you are say working from home, the responsibility would be much higher on women to kind of care work than compared to men. So the amount of time, effort they could put in their job was more affected than men than women, right? So this means that kind of we're already in bad state pre-pandemic, and that kind of continued there. And then now we are in a situation where the women's kind of labor force participation has gone down. And uh, I mean, for I think one of the major part that we need to do is economic growth of India is gender equality in terms of wages as well as labor force participation, right? And as you rightly pointed out, gender norms play a huge role in kind of getting women to labor force, right? So those things have, because they've been so severely affected. I'm it's gonna be a big kind of hurdle to cross for us as a country. And we are like, there is also not just social norms, it's supporting infrastructure, right? For example, we need like, for example, childcare is a big thing, right? So if we don't have good infrastructure in place for people to kind of crash or anything where people can have their children safely, that essentially stops women from kind of joining the labor force, right? So some of these factors need to be addressed infrastructurally. Some of these have to be addressed through kind of a supply side, right? Like, so women themselves, their households changing, but also from demand sides where workplace are more women friendly, like, and those are the things that kind of needs to happen from workplace. Because in India, even though government makes laws, it doesn't have capability or like governance ability to kind of actually enforce it in many cases, right? So in that way, it's important for all the actors to like play their part. Just for example, to give some context, like we're trying working with government of Jharkhand on a skilling program for women in Jharkhand. And the amount of kind of, so one of the things that the program offers is entrepreneurial training, which you can essentially get the training and start your own small business, some income generating activity in your village, while other programs are vocational opportunities, which will allow you to which will kind of need to you take up a job, and that means mostly moving out of your village, right? And many girls that we talked said they would want to take this job, but their family wouldn't allow them to, right? So then, and that kind of social norm is something very prevalent, right? So these are the things that kind of needs to be addressed to allow women to kind of participate. And it's like, it's a big problem with like multiple issues, and these, all of them need to address like step by step, right? So for example, if you're having women employees in the factories, are like, do you have policies that support them, right? Like for example, if you have abusive managers at the factories, that kind of makes an hostile workplace, and especially for women who might not speak out that much, you have support system for them in place, right? So some of these things have to happen across the board to kind of change the norms as well as infrastructure available opportunities. One of the also major thing is our occupations are still gender segregated in many cases. Like if you go to schools, teachers are still female, women, while if you go to say tech firms, there are still more men there, right? Like, so some of these stereotypes needs to change. Like women are good in arts, men are good in science, like some of these false stereotypes that exist and are kind of many times reinforced by even the people themselves because they've been told that way. Those also need to change across the board to kind of get, because uh, like there are opportunities that pay more which exist, but women think these are men dominated fields, that's why they wouldn't take it up, right? So some of these start needing to change either through role model effect, government policies, uh, training of men, especially about like a lot of men think that these are men's job and women can't do it, which is many times patronizing, where a lot of people think they are trying to protect women rather like thinking of protecting women, their safety, rather than actually treating them equally. So some of these things need to change, and it's hard to kind of say, okay, there is no one solution. Like, so you need to have like multiple solution, like attacking or like targeting multiple things happening to kind of make it, and also realizing it's gonna take time. Like, I mean, people like these are the very entrenched beliefs that people have, and it takes time. And also it's not just that it takes time, these are not costless, right? Like, so for example, a lot of women who join labor force, their lives are much harder because they're doing now job. But so for example, we work a lot with garment factory workers, and in garment industry many of the workers are women, right? So they, when their, even though their shift starts at 9, many of them have to wake up at 5, 5:30, finish entire household chores that they are do, like cooking, cleaning, washing. Then they take a bus to come to factories. Then they finish their shifts. Then when they go back, they need to cook, work, and then like, so that's essentially doing twice the work, right? And some of these are in, well, some welfare sense they might be even worse off than not doing the job because it's just too much toll on them, right? So for example, looking at it, women used to, then the one of the advantage of care work is they, women would spend more time with their children compared to men, right? So that's the one of the advantage of giving more time to care work. But now you take that away, and some of the people might not like the trade-offs they're making, right? So this is also not costless process. Like, this would have some kind of negative externalities on the people themselves, right? Women themselves, or like a, like just trying to adjust to this, and there will be resistance. So some of the literature, like, so intimate partner violence sometimes increases when women kind of enter labor force, because kind of their their male partners kind of wants to assert their dominance, because if they can't assert economically, through other means, right? So some of these factors kind of need to be thought out and addressed when we kind of start wanting the society norms and existing structures to change, right? And that needs to be considered when we do this.
Right. And now to conclude the interview, we would like to know, would it be possible for you to share something about your current research questions? And also, how have you seen development economics develop as a field over the years since you first started working in this area?
So last question, I am not 60 years old to give you a brief brief like how the field has developed. But yeah, let me, I mean, yeah, so I mean, so some of this has kind of become like, just to address the last question first, it's much, it, at least the field has become more data oriented. It has become more kind of tuned to kind of causal inference of trying to identify. Some of them will think it's a good thing, bad thing, but also just majorly empirical field much more. So if you go to past, the proportion of theory in econ was way higher, theorizing, uh, but now it has become much more applied field where people are using data, real world experiments. If not, they're not doing experiment, they're still using some form of data through administrative data, survey data to kind of inform decisions, right? So it has become more empirical field in such way, and that's become one of the major changes I feel in like last 10, 15 years. um, Also people have become much more like for field, like actually trying to be looking at on ground realities a bit more. So that's one. So just trying to tell more about the current. So I work for a kind of place called Good Business Lab. So we are kind of a organization which is majorly a research organization, as well as scaling up is something that we want to do. So we work, our kind of motive is to work with uh, blue collar workers, and then try to find intervention solution which essentially helps workers as well as businesses. So what I mean is there are a lot of intervention that are done within firms through global supply chain programs that are run majorly as a philanthropic intentions, rather than actually trying to see. So firms, if you're doing, you would ask to do because it's good thing to do, not good business to do, right? So what we're trying to see is like that's not kind of two things, they are part of the same coin. Where for most many of the things that exist, where if firms treat their workers well, if they invest in their workers through either their skill building or kind of providing more amenities, that has productivity benefit for the firm itself. So for example, just to give a concrete example of what we do, one of the experiments that we did was so Gap, the firm, has a program called PACE, which is essentially giving soft skill training to female garment workers. Now, so a lot of these programs exist, but they are not rigorously tested, so you don't know whether they work or not. And the firms many times would do because it's a good thing to do, right? Like won't have things, they would have some notion of it helps them, but not in a very concrete sense. So what we did was we ran an RCT for these. What we did was there are like around 3,000 women which had expressed interest in training this program, and then we kind of around half of them, uh, I think one third of them, we gave this program where they were enrolled in the program. And then we tracked their kind of productivity, absenteeism, attrition level throughout the program, and even like few months after the program. And then we compared the people who had gotten this program versus people who didn't. So we then analyze through their surveys what impact it had on them. But we also had the data from the firm to look at, say, absenteeism, attrition, or their productivity. What we found there was it had around positive return on investment. So, for example, if a firm had invested 100 rupees in these trainings in just more than a year, in terms of productivity, they got around 250 rupees back just from productivity, right? So, it's kind of a rate of return around 259%. So that's essentially showing that you just, this program, don't do this as just kind of philanthropy, but this is good business for you, right? So we are trying to, at particular focus is like firms are important part of development puzzle. Like you can't just have government, like you need to generate employment and generate good employment and provide good employment opportunity to women, and some of these program can help. So this is just one example of the project we've done and research question. Some of the work we are doing, so this is one kind of thing which is like we have kind of multiple project on soft skills. So the we are working with government of Jharkhand, where we are kind of, it is like adolescent girls and young women, like upskilling program. We're starting a program in Bihar around similar lines, also kind of trying to do this across. So for example, we, once we realized it works for workers, we did like frontline managers, their supervisors, and then try to do soft skill training with them, and that had even crazy impact in terms of monetary return for firm, like in terms of around 5 to 6,000% rate of return, right? So this is one line. Then we have a lot of workplace interview, like providing workers voice in terms of their grievance redressal tools, using technologies that can send SMS to kind of anonymously send their grievances. And kind of we are working a lot on mental health. So there are a lot of migrant workers who come in. So imagine, like, if you are a 22 year girl coming from village to a city, where you are kind of working in a hostel, and then you kind of do this grilling 6 days work shift, right? You are many times you're broke. Like, when you are still in your village, you still have social capital, social network, support system. When you're thrown into a urban setting, many times those disappear. You don't have, like, the work is hard, you are lonely, so loneliness, mental depression becomes a huge issue. So you're trying to address that, so kind of burdening you up, and like cognitive behavior therapy. So these are some of the kind of projects many more which I'm forgetting now, but these are some of the programs we're doing, and most of these are randomized controlled trial where we are working on these questions, solving this problem, and trying to see. I think one of the, I think one of, I think BSc third year student is interning with us at the moment, and he is working on one of our research project where we are seeing what are the impact of giving like free eyeglasses to people, because a lot of people have uncorrected vision, and then they don't wear glasses, uh, and then that has been like impact on them, but also huge impact on stitching, which is like very intensive work, right? So we are trying to see whether that improves productivity. But these are some of the projects we're doing.
Thank you, so. It was really interesting talking to you. Thank you so much for being a part of Coffee Contalk.
Thanks.
Thank you, sir.